Hello, my wonderful third graders. I hope you're having a fantastic day. We are still learning about Native Americans, regions, and cultures. And today our lesson is over Native Americans in the Southwest, part 1. So that means you're only getting half of the information today. We will learn more about the Southwest Native Americans tomorrow. Some vocabulary you will hear throughout the read aloud. Adobe is a sun-dried brick made of clay, the clay material from which such bricks are formed. There are many adobe homes built in the Southwest because the materials to make the bricks are readily available there. Ancestral is an adjective. It describes something. It means relating to one's ancestors or prior generations. Every summer, all of my cousins visit our ancestral village in Ireland. Arid is an adjective. It describes something not having enough rainfall to support most vegetation. Very dry. The arid climate of northern Africa often makes it difficult to grow crops. Cliff dwellings are multi-storied stone buildings with many rooms set into mountainsides, similar to apartments. They're pretty cool looking. Diverted is a verb of something that can be done, turned away from one path to another. The police diverted traffic away from the parade route. Intricately is an adverb. Remember, the ly suffix is usually an adverb. Complexly, elaborately. The dance was so intricately designed that only professional dancers could perform it, which would include our cadence. Mesas are land formations with high, flat tops and steep sides, similar to plateaus, but smaller and higher, like raised tabletops. Pueblos are villages of buildings made from flat stone or sun-dried clay bricks. More than 3,000 years ago, in the river valleys north, south, east, and west of the Mississippi River, groups of Native Americans began to settle. What are these groups of people known as? Remember last time we talked about mound builders. Do you remember where Mississippi is on the map? It is this river right here that splits the United States in half, runs from the north to the south, and then if you follow these rivers that come off of it, we have the Ohio River here that goes all the way to Kentucky. If you go to Louisville, you can see the Ohio River. If you go up to Cincinnati, you'll cross the Ohio River to get into Ohio. How did people get enough food in this area to enable them to survive? They hunted, gathered, and began to farm. They grew beans and squash and also grew corn. They probably did some fishing in the river. How did farming lead to semi-permanent or permanent settlements? Well, farming required people who were willing to settle in one place and be able to take care of their crops. You couldn't just plant crops and say, "See you later, crops. Take care of yourselves. I'll be back when you're ready." Right? You have to water them and pull weeds and take care of them for them to grow correctly. So people had to stick around. Europeans came up with many of these tribal names when they first came to North America and encountered the people who were already living there. The Europeans did not necessarily know the correct names these people called themselves because they didn't often know their languages. At times, the names the Europeans created for the Native Americans were in fact unkind names, similar to the Navajo's name for the Ancestral Pueblo. A history is written and rewritten due to new and sometimes changing information. We try to use language that is respectful of the heritage and past cultures in a group of people. Some other examples of Native American names changing are the Navajo, who are now called the Dene, the Eskimos, who are in fact the Inuit, and the Iroquois, who call themselves Haudenosaunee. You'll be hearing more about these groups in an upcoming read aloud. words. So we really want to be respectful of other people's cultures and call them things that are respectful and use respectful language. And especially calling them the name they would call themselves, right? You wouldn't want somebody to walk into our classroom and be like, "Hey, you there, you look like a Philip. I'm going to call you Philip." You're like, my name is Xander. That would be frustrating. At the same time the early mound builders were living in the Mississippi River areas, other groups of Native Americans were creating their own cultures in the American Southwest. So if we look at this, we can see this is the Southwest down here near Texas and Mexico, Arizona. We were talking about this area right here where the Mississippi River is. Now we're talking about the Southwest. With it being in the Southwest, how do you think the setting has changed? How do you think the temperature and its effect on the culture has changed? When we go more south towards the equator, it gets hotter, right? How do you think life would be different in this area as compared to the areas near the Mississippi River where the mound builders lived? Predict how the cultures of these groups in the Southwest may have been different. How would it have been different down towards the Southwest than up by the Mississippi River? Marshall has been to Arizona. He can tell us what it's like. Is there a bunch of water there, Marshall? More than 3,000 years ago in the American Southwest, groups of native peoples began to move away from a nomadic existence of hunting and gathering to early forms of farming. In particular, they began to grow crops such as corn and squash. However, in such a dry and arid region, these early people could not survive by farming alone. While the land could provide some additional food, the people in this region continued to hunt and gather with simple tools such as clubs, hunting sticks, and spears. Archaeologists believe that some of these early peoples may have inhabited natural caves, but most lived in pit houses. In addition to experimenting with crops, they began to hunt with bows and arrows. What do you think a pit house is? A pit house is a home dug into the ground. They lived in holes that they dug in the ground. Wouldn't that be an interesting life? It kind of makes sense though, doesn't it? Approximately 2,000 years later, some groups of native peoples in this region began to develop more sophisticated farming methods that included the use of irrigation, the ability to channel water to crops. Now that it was possible to grow crops more successfully, these native peoples became committed to the areas where their crops grew. As a result, they began to settle in one place. This meant that southwestern native culture began to develop and thrive. Some of these groups of people included the Ancestral Pueblo, the Mugayon, and the Hohokam. Mugayo and Hohokam. So you can see this picture here. Can you see how the water is being directed to the crops? Do you see the ditches that they've dug from the river to their crops? This is one way that the culture of the Ancestral Pueblo was different from that of the mound builders. They had irrigation. The Mugayon inhabited the mountainous areas of southwestern New Mexico and east central Arizona. They diverted streams so that they could water their crops and may even have experimented with ways of storing water. The let me make sure I say that right. The Hohokam inhabited the desert areas of what is present-day southern Arizona. They built a network of canals that channeled water to their fields. This type of early engineering helped these people overcome the challenges presented by their environment. This read aloud focuses on the Ancestral Pueblo, who lived in an area of the Southwest and connects present-day Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. This area is often referred to as the Four Corners. The Ancestral Pueblo lived throughout this region. Many lived in the dry valleys near smaller rivers or waterways. Some, having struggled with the challenges of living in the drier valley areas, moved on to the raised plateaus and mesas. Just like the Mugolans and the Hohokam, the Ancestral Pueblo developed ways to divert water from streams and rivers to irrigate their fields. Over many years, land becomes eroded by rivers and streams. First, plateaus are formed, which then turn into mesas and then into buttes, the tallest tower-like structures seen here. Oh, those are really cool looking. So this is where the Four Corners are, and we see Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. So they all meet there, and that's where these people groups lived. There are many reasons why some of the Ancestral Pueblo moved up onto the green mesas. There were trees growing on these mesas that provided the native people with shelter and wood. Because mesas are raised flatlands or plateaus, they receive more sunlight than the valleys below, and the mesas receive more rain and snow, making them a more ideal environment for growing crops. However, whether they lived on the mesas or in the valleys, they were able to have a larger food supply, and as a result, the Ancestral Pueblo population increased and their culture developed. Over time, they began to grow a variety of crops, including beans, which are higher in protein. They began to raise turkeys and use their feathers to make blankets and feathered robes. They constructed pit houses that were dug into the ground and covered with tree branches, leaves, and dirt. The Ancestral Pueblo moved on to building homes above ground. Initially, they used wood and adobe, a sun-dried brick made from clay, to construct simple homes. Eventually, they became skilled stoneworkers and learned how to construct extremely solid homes that were several stories high. Some of these homes had as many as 100 connecting rooms. Holy cow! These structures were the earliest forms of high-rise buildings. The flat rooftops of these impressive buildings had a special function in the fall. Crops that had been harvested were laid out on the flat rooftops to dry in the warm sunshine. Those are some pretty cool looking houses. Oh, here's some actual photographs. The Ancestral Pueblo began to live in large settlements or villages. It was not unusual for hundreds of people to live in one village. These villages eventually became known as pueblos, the Spanish word for towns. The Ancestral Pueblo continued to construct rooms beneath the ground, but over time these underground rooms, called kivas, changed shape. They became round or keyhole shaped. A special few were much larger and used only for important religious ceremonies. The Ancestral Pueblo worshipped nature gods. It is thought they believed that humans were first created inside the earth. Eventually, they crawled out onto the surface of the earth. This is called a creation story. Each kiva contained a hole in the ground to signify its belief. The Ancestral Pueblo became known for their stonework, their expert basket weaving, and their pottery. Their basket weaving in particular was quite extraordinary. Their baskets were beautifully designed and intricately woven. They were so carefully woven that after they were coated with mud and baked by the sun, they could be used for cooking, carrying water, and storing harvested crops. The Ancestral Pueblo used yucca bark and various plant fibers to make baskets, ropes, mats, and sandals. They planted cotton and used it to make lighter, more comfortable clothing. They developed pottery that varied in color, size, and texture. The Ancestral Pueblo mined turquoise stone and used it in their jewelry. They traded turquoise pots and cotton with other native groups. Each family ate meals together. The head man of the home offered food to the gods. He did this by throwing a small amount of food onto the fire that was used to cook the food. The Ancestral Pueblo looked to their environment for the things they needed. Who can recall some of the items mentioned in the read aloud that were made from natural materials? Their homes, their clothes, their food, their baskets, their ropes, their mats, their pots right? Anything they made, all they had was nature. They didn't have a bunch of plastic stuff at the Walmart like we do. The Ancestral Pueblo were a spiritual people who lived their lives with thoughtful intention and careful plans. The people in each pueblo were part of a specific clan or tribe. Each clan was given an equal amount of farmland. The Ancestral Pueblo were skillful farmers, builders, and craftsmen. It would have been an extraordinary sight to see a busy Ancestral Pueblo village, to live and walk amongst the stone structures that blended so well with the environment. Moving through the town, you might see the ancient craftsmen at work or observe the religious leaders urging the nature gods to help them. And during the growing season, you could watch the conscientious or careful farmers in their fields tending to their crops. Strangely, for reasons we cannot fully explain, the Ancestral Pueblo began to abandon their homes. Instead, they began to construct homes called cliff dwellings beneath or at the base of the cliffs. It's possible that the decision to abandon their more exposed homes was because of safety and security. The Ancestral Pueblo may have been in constant conflict with other neighboring groups of people. Certainly, these new structures beneath the cliffs were more defensible. The Ancestral Pueblo population lived more closely together in these enormous cliff structures. Some of these structures had as many as 1,000 rooms, oh my, and rose up 4 stories high beneath the cliff. That's ginormous. The cliff dwellings were difficult to get to, though. People had to climb up and down using finger and footholds carved into the rock. Nevertheless, the Ancestral Pueblo continued to irrigate and tend to their fields, and their craftsmanship continued to flourish, at least for a while. How do we know all this about the Pueblo, the Ancestral Pueblo? Our point of view, where we get all our information, right, is from archaeologists that have found these homes dug into cliffs, that have found the remnants of these baskets that they've created, that have found pots and different things. Because remember, this is prehistoric. The Ancestral Pueblo didn't write anything down. So how cool is it that archaeologists dig these things up and are able to discover so much information? Maybe you guys would like to be an archaeologist someday. What challenges do you think people may have faced living in such cramped conditions? Right? 1,000-roomed house? Man, having to live in small, confined spaces might have caused conflict. There was a limited amount of workspace and living space. Getting in and out of the cliff dwelling was quite difficult. Transporting necessary items in and out would have been challenging. There may have been problems with sanitation and hygiene. Can you imagine? How would you get water all the way up there? You have to haul it on your back while you rock climbed. Woo! However, there is another mystery surrounding these ancient peoples. By about AD 1300, the Ancestral Pueblo had left these magnificent homes never to return again. It seems that over a period of time, family groups walked away from their ancestral homes and set out into the arid valleys. They left behind all their tools and supplies used in daily life and went in search of other places to settle. Historians seem sure that they went to other areas of Southwest, including the Little Colorado River regions of Arizona and the Rio Grande River of New Mexico. Scientists and historians also know that there was a great drought between 1276 and 1299. This would have caused crop failure and possible starvation. Wars with other native groups would certainly have added to the struggle to survive. Perhaps too many problems arose for the people trying to live in such cramped conditions that they could not overcome them. Although we do not know why the Ancestral Pueblo people left their homes, we do know that they raised families, celebrated life, felt the warmth of the sun, and left footprints in the snow. They left enough of themselves that we can imagine their lives, and archaeologists can put together some of the pieces. We are connected to them by our own presence here on the earth and the knowledge that their descendants still thrive in part of the American Southwest. So there's Pueblo Native Americans that can trace their lineage to this ancestral Pueblo Native Americans. You heard about the Ancestral Pueblo, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam today. Where did these Native Americans live? The Four Corner area of the Southwest region in North America. Which four states meet at the Four Corners where these people lived? Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. As with the mound builders, the Ancestral Pueblo began to change the way they lived. What was the main reason for this? While the people still hunted and gathered, they began to farm, especially crops such as corn and squash. Because they farmed, they stayed in one area for at least part of the year and needed more permanent homes. They began to produce household items needed for settlement. Their daily lives helped to create a regional culture. Who can describe what you see in this picture? What do you see in this picture? What are they doing? People diverting water from rivers to fields. They've created an irrigation system. Why did the native people in this region have to divert water from rivers to their fields? Climate was arid, not enough precipitation on a regular basis to grow crops without getting water from other sources such as rivers. They basically didn't have enough rain, so they had to find a way to get water from the river. Some ancestral Pueblo settled on mesas. What were their reasons for moving up onto this higher ground? There were trees growing on the mesas that provided people with building materials. The raised areas received more sunlight, which is good for growing crops, and the mesas received more rain and snow. What type of homes did the early ancestral people live in? Pit houses dug in the ground and covered with tree branches, leaves, and dirt, right at first. What is the name given to the large settlements or villages created by the Ancestral Pueblo? Pueblos. Have the descendants of the Ancestral Pueblo disappeared entirely from the Southwest? No, their descendants still inhabit the region today. What intricately designed item did the Ancestral Pueblo coat with mud and then bake? What were they known for? Baskets. How did the Ancestral Pueblo use these baskets? For cooking, carrying water, and storing harvested crops. As part of their cultural identity, the Ancestral Pueblo had certain religious beliefs. Where did they believe the first people were created, and how did they believe these people came to the earth? They thought that people were created inside the earth and then crawled to the surface through a hole in the ground. In the previous read aloud, you heard about another group of people who built something that was used for their religious ceremonies. What was that group of people, and what did they build for use in their religious ceremonies? You remember way back from last week. The mound builders, and they built mounds. What type of gods did the Ancestral Pueblo worship? Nature gods. From your point of view, could the Ancestral Pueblo have built mounds as the Mississippians did? Why or why not? I do think it's interesting that the Ancestral Pueblo built mounds above the earth as sacred places for their gods, to worship their gods. And then, the mound builders built the mounds. And then the Ancestral Pueblo built holes, which is like the opposite of a mound. That's really interesting. Excuse me. Our word for today is intricately. In the read aloud you heard, their baskets were beautifully designed and intricately woven. Say the word intricately with me. Intricately. It's actually kind of fun to say. Intricately means designed in such a way that something has many interrelated or interconnected parts and pieces. Each piece of the jigsaw puzzle was intricately connected with the other pieces. Have you ever seen something that you would describe as being intricately designed? What was it? All right. Good job, third graders. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Ancestral Pueblo today.